Seems like every AAA studio these days is on a binge right now on who can make the most remakes and remasters. Honestly, I think it's gotten pretty out of hand, and it feels like developers are just running out of new ideas at this point and are just saying, hey, let's just put a fresh coat of paint over a game that's already been made and charge people full price for it. Majority of games that have gotten the remake or remaster treatment lately really didn't need it in the first place. Resident Evil 4 is an example of a game that really didn't need it, but I can honestly say that after playing it, I was really surprised. While the remake has been generally pretty well received, there has been some division on which is better, the remake or the 2005 original. A lot has changed in the remake, and I do mean a lot. Some areas have been made completely different or revamped in some way or another, and the core combat loop in general plays noticeably different than the original. Every boss fight plays quite a bit different now too, some better than the original, and some worse.
Think you can swallow me whole?
Why won't you die?
It also seems like as this game went on, there were more and more creative liberties Capcom took with this game. Some may feel the big departure from the original is a bad thing, especially for something that's supposed to be a remake, but I would argue that the deviations that the remake does are some of its greatest strengths. Before I get to RE4 Remake though, let me give an example of a remake that I think did its source material a little bit of a disservice. Resident Evil 1 Remake. Alright, okay, you can put the pitchforks down. I'm not saying that this game is bad. It's actually pretty good. Actually, it's really, really good. It took the original game and made it so much better. It improved on nearly every aspect from the PS1 original, and it's the best way to play Resident Evil 1 today. And therein lies the problem. The existence of the remake has made the PS1 original obsolete. Yeah, there are some small differences. Maybe you don't like the Crimson Heads in the remake, or maybe you just like killing stuff more. There's definitely a lot more zombie killing in the PS1 version, but that's a very, very specific niche to fall into, and broadly speaking, the remake is so faithful to the original and improves on things so much that there really isn't any reason to play the original anymore instead of the remake, unless you're just wanting to play the original for nostalgia or just to see what the original game was like. Neither of those reasons though are for the quality of the game itself, but rather you're just playing it for some kind of novelty. This puts the original in a weird state of irrelevancy where it's been more or less replaced completely by the remake because it's clearly the definitive version. This is kind of sad because the significance and impact of the original isn't felt as strongly anymore. Rather than the game standing on its own, it's been reduced to just being a worse version of another, newer, better game. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Resident Evil 2 and its 2019 remake. Big difference between how 2's remake was handled and how 1's remake was handled. 1 remake stays very true and faithful to its original, while 2 takes a lot more creative liberties and strays far from the path of the original. It still hits all the same key moments, you know, like RPD, the sewers, the underground lab, Mr. X, but the remake plays completely differently. Whereas 1 remake gave an improved but similar experience to the original, 2 remake opted for a wholly unique experience. You can't jump from the PS1 version straight to the remake and still feel like you're playing a similar game. It's so different in fact that there's a lot of different opinions on this game. There are people that adore the original but despise the remake, and vice versa. Whether or not you enjoy 2 Remake is pretty subjective, you know, like with any game there's good and there's bad, it just really depends on what you're looking for in a game, but there's one thing that's a fact. 2 Remake's existence did not diminish the value of the PS1 original. To this day, the classic RE2 still holds up incredibly well and is a good game on its own. It's not a worse version of 2 Remake. Instead, they both stand on their own as different games and can be judged independently from each other. This is why I think the 2 Remake is so good. And since we're going down this rabbit hole already, I might as well touch up on RE3 and its 2020 remake. RE3 is the classic Resident Evil that I've played the least, and its remake is the remake I've played the least. Big shocker, I know. I don't have too much experience with either one of these games, but 3 Remake definitely drops the ball in some areas. It's good when a remake isn't scared to stray from the path of the original and try something new and different, but there's a slight caveat with that. A remake still needs to hit the same beats that the original does, just interpret interpreted in a new and interesting way. And for anything that is missing, there needs to be something else of substance in its place. This is where the 3 remake really took a blunder. There's just way too much cut content to justify a remake, and there wasn't really anything new added to replace the content that was missing, at least not enough to really make a difference. Things like the clock tower not being here is inexcusable, and it would have made the 3 remake a lot better, both as a remake but also just as a game in general. That being said, I still think the game is fun for what it is, it's just way too short and bare bones. It's pretty apparent though that Capcom's goal with this game wasn't to make something faithful to the original or even to try something new with RE3. Nah, it was just to capitalize on the popularity of 2 Remake and was rush out the door for a quick buck. Alright, back to Resident Evil 4. That was a bit of a detour just to go back to the starting point, but now there's a little bit more perspective on my opinions on what makes a good remake going into the 4 remake. Resident Evil 4 Remake is not a one-to-one faithful remake, and instead opts to go the 2 remake path and make something a lot different from the original. RE4 Remake at times feels like an adaptation of the original game rather than a remake. It hits the same beats as the original, but in its own unique style. It's like a music cover of a classical piece. Some may enjoy the sound of the cover more than the original, but let's not kid ourselves here, the original will always have the most respect. Which one you like more though is pretty subjective. The remake does not exist to outperform the original, but rather exist alongside it. Some may find the changes in the remake annoying or unnecessary, like stealth, item crafting, parrying, or the more resilient enemies, but this carving of its own path separate from the original is what helps give the remake its own identity. The original Resident Evil 4 was lightning caught in a bottle. It was a game of a certain quality that couldn't just be replicated. That game could have only existed and been as good as it was if it was made by that specific team at that specific time with those specific resources. It's one of those things that where the stars just aligned and something truly special was made. Then Capcom realized this when making 4 Remake and knew that there was no way they were going to catch lightning twice. So instead they tried to carve out something different. The original's framework is still there, you can still feel it, but it still finds a way to make the experience all its own, and this is one of its greatest strengths. The remake's ability to exist side by side with the original, with neither one diminishing the value of the other. After completing my 4th playthrough of Remake, I was starting to feel a little bored and decided to go back and play the original again. To my surprise, the original still feels fresh, even coming right after the remake. Not only that, but after spending a considerable amount of time with the remake, you start to find a new appreciation for the original. Not because the remake is bad, but because it really opens your eyes to how strong the foundation was in the original game and how much it was ahead of its time. 4 Remake doesn't take anything away from the original, but in some ways adds to it, which is not an easy feat. Truth be told, I think remakes have just gone way overboard. A game, especially a good quality one, is something that needs to be preserved, not unnecessarily improved upon. It's okay for something to just get old. Remakes definitely feel like it's becoming a way for developers to just cash in on the success of their predecessors and have hopes that customers will pay full price again for something that already exists, just with a fresh coat of paint this time. Players will often buy remakes in the hopes that it will make them feel the same way the original did. That's often why I buy them. But, and this is just something to accept, no remake or remaster will ever make you feel the same way the original did. Similar to how the original team at Capcom caught lightning in a bottle with OG Resident Evil 4, your feelings towards your favorite games are often tied to the circumstances of the time you played it. Those circumstances can never be replicated. 4 Remake could have tried to improve on the original, but that would have just ended in disappointment. There would be no way it could live up to that. Instead, it chose to give a fresh experience with something that still manages to feel familiar. Not only is the remake better if you've played the original time and time again, but after playing the remake, it can make you enjoy the original even more. This relationship between the two is why Resident Evil 4 is the perfect remake.